Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hello there. Garnet Jenis back with another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm excited that we're going to be trying this year to bring you a new episode every week, talking about critical current issues and also digging deeper into some of the background around them. And also, we're going to be mixing up the format a little bit, having more feature-length interviews instead of the two-part format that we've generally done in the past. And today, I am so excited about the very special, very prominent guest we have, Bill Browder, someone who really needs no introduction for those that follow events in Russia and Eastern Europe, as well as international human rights advocacy. Bill was the biggest investor in Russia, and he, as a result of some experiences that he had with the Putin regime, has now gone from the biggest investor to Russia to the biggest international human rights activist vis-a-vis the situation in Russia. So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
I'm glad to be here and honored to be with you, who I consider to be one of the true heroes of human rights in Canada. And so it's great to talk to you.
Thank you. I'll pay you afterwards for those kind words. But your book, Red Notice, is one that I think everyone should read. It shares your story as this rebellious American kid who the most rebellious thing you could do in your family was to become a capitalist, coming from a family of some prominent communists and in the U.S., and then becoming a big investor and all the things you experienced being in Eastern Europe and Russia. Everyone should buy and read your book because we don't have time to give the full synopsis. But if you could start off, by those who are less familiar with story, by just sharing where you came from and how you ended up so involved in events in Russia.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I come from a sort of strange American family. I was born in Princeton, New Jersey, grew up in Chicago, but my family was, well, I should say my grandfather was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas. And he was so good at organizing the union that he was spotted by the communists. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia, check it out? And so he moved to Moscow in 1927. He met a young Russian girl who became my grandmother. And my father was born there. And then 5 years later, they returned to America and he became the general secretary of the American Communist Party. He ran for president against Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940. He was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 1941, pardoned in 42. He eventually was kicked out of the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then viciously persecuted during the 1950s, during the McCarthy era, for his obvious communist connections. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 57 years old. But when I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, I was trying to figure out a good way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I tried out several things that didn't work. I grew my hair long, and it grew into an afro. And that strangely didn't upset my family. I followed the Grateful Dead around the country for a couple months. That didn't upset my family. But then I finally came up with the perfect way of upsetting my family, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And there was nothing that upset my family more than that. So I became a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated business school in 1989, which was a very auspicious year because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do post-business school, I had an epiphany one day, which is that if my grandfather is the biggest communist in America, and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so post-Stanford, that's what I set out to do. I moved to London, and then I eventually moved to Moscow, and I ended up setting up an investment fund. It was called the Hermitage Fund, to invest in the Russian stock market after the mass privatization program at the end of the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so a fascinating story, and again, I can't recommend your book enough to people. America and Russia, two very different worlds, obviously in terms of the political systems, but also at a deeper cultural level. Tell us a bit about just how Russia is different, how Russian politics are different. What are the things that maybe are often misunderstood in terms of that significant cultural cleavage?
Well, so when I got to Russia, it was a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and a few years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And they kind of declared themselves to be no longer communist. They kind of declared themselves to be a capitalist country where people could do business and own property. And they did all this. And then they did a mass privatization program where they gave everything away to the people, or they wanted to give everything away to the people for free to create a country full of property owners. And the thing that they hadn't really thought about in all of these things was it was kind of like building a house, and they forgot to put in the plumbing and electricity. And so the plumbing and electricity was the rule of law and property rights, and it kind of affected everything. And so, you know, they had democracy, so to speak, but you know, they were stuffing the ballot boxes. They had you know, banks, but the bank owners were stealing from the depositors. They had public companies, but the majority shareholders were stealing all the profits out the back door. And so it was this kind of theoretical country where everybody was kind of operating on a very basic level. And it wasn't like I don't think these people even thought themselves to be corrupt. They just thought themselves to be, you know, just, you know, this was, you know, nobody had trained them any differently. And so you basically had a country which, where everything was new, everything was Wild West, and anyone could do anything. And it created all sorts of opportunities, business opportunities, political opportunities. I mean, anyone could become anything at that point in time. But at the same time, it also created a lot of terrible disparities for the average Russian. Most, you know, you kind of had to have sharp elbows to succeed there. And most Russians were just like regular, honest, day-to-day people that didn't have sharp elbows. And so they ended up losing out on everything. You know, if you just kind of played by the rules, you know, if you just collected your salary as a professor, you ended up becoming impoverished. If you, you know, if you played fairly in almost anything, it was a bad situation. And so most Russians were being humiliated, I guess, in a really terrible way. And I think this is what created the seeds of the dictatorship that we have right now, which is that you know, so many people were in so many different ways put in so many unpleasant situations that everybody was sort of looking for some way to get back at whatever they thought the problem was. And that's Putin came in and kind of offered them what people thought was hope, but they ended up discovering that it was even worse than before.
Mm-hmm. So this I think helps to explain why there was that nostalgia for the kind of Soviet period that Putin played up on, the kind of chaos of a kind of cartoonish version of capitalism that wasn't a capitalist system as we understand it, but that hadn't improved people's lives in the way they expect, and therefore there was this nostalgia for Russian greatness as well as for some level of order. Is that a fair synopsis of how we got from there to here?
Well, I think it is a very fair synopsis, because everybody felt, you know, everyone associated democracy and capitalism with chaos and humiliation, and so that was the basis for which. You know, that's kind of why we are where we are. I mean, unfortunately, everybody has since realized that now they didn't get the nostalgic version of the Soviet Union. However, anyone remembered that they didn't. You know, I mean, and there were some good things about the Soviet Union. I mean, you know, nobody was hungry, nobody was starving. You know, everybody was educated. Life was predictable in a lot of different ways. they got all the bad parts of the Soviet Union without the good parts. So life continues to be impoverished and unpredictable and horrible, but now they have all the same sort of, secret police and no democracy and no can't say what you think. You have to like whisper it in your kitchen. And so you end up in a situation where it's now you have the worst of both worlds. You're the worst of that terrible period of time when they were just discovering capitalism, and the worst of the totalitarian lifestyle of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So as we look at the kind of emerging crisis threats of invasion in Ukraine, I think connecting to what you're talking about the maybe the nostalgia that was there at the beginning, but the unfulfilled promise of the Putin dictatorship. A lot of people I've talked to have said that part of the threat to Ukraine comes from Putin's declining popularity inside of Russia, and he has this history of using extreme violence to try to shift attention when he's facing personal unpopularity. I'd love to hear your reflections on how the dynamic you just described is informing Putin's own popularity in Russia, how we can know or how we can measure how popular he is or isn't, and the extent to which these kind of foreign aggression things being contemplated may come out of that unpopularity.
Well, I'm really glad you're focusing on this, and I think you're one of the knowledgeable ones, or have gained the knowledge in your question about this, because what Putin is doing right now is it's not a function of anything to do with the history of the Soviet Union. It has to do with Vladimir Putin's own weakness and his own fear. So let's just look at Vladimir Putin and go back in time a little bit. When he first came to power, nobody knew who he was, and he kind of presented this image that he was going to be cleaning everything up and making life better. And that really wasn't his intention. He didn't clean anything up. He made life worse. And people were angry with the oligarchs, and he said he was going to get rid of the oligarchs, but instead he became the biggest oligarch himself. One of the biggest parts of his leadership was to steal as much money as possible from as many people as possible, from the state, from other people, from everybody, and he's accumulated a vast fortune. And as he's accumulated this vast fortune, it comes at somebody else's expense, and it comes at the expense of the Russian people. And so the hospitals are barren. There's no equipment there. The schools don't have textbooks. They can't pay the teachers. There's huge potholes in the roads. All that money that should have been spent on the Russian people has been stolen by Putin and about 1,000 other people who surround him. And it's been spent on villas and private planes and yachts and all sorts of other stuff. And most of that money is no longer in Russia. And so after about 20 years of this, people have gotten really angry. They're saying, and they're not angry. They're not necessarily angry at anybody, just angry that they're hungry and they haven't gotten what they want. And after some period of time, they look to their leader and say, well, you can't blame this on anybody else now. This is on you. And so what does a guy like Putin do in that situation? It's not like he says, okay, we better really improve the livelihoods and standard of living of our people, because that would mean giving back the money he stole, which he has no intention of doing. So what does he do? He starts to go after the people who are most vocal inside the country of complaining, and arrests them, tries to kill others. So he killed Boris Nemtsov, who was a former leader of the opposition. He tried to kill Alexei Navalny, who is another very popular opposition character who he tried to poison with Novichok. But just getting rid of the most powerful voices of dissent isn't enough for Putin. He needed to try to do something else, and it's sort of standard in the dictator's playbook that if people are angry with you, you need to deflect their anger towards somebody else. And so that's what this whole conflict in Ukraine is about. And it didn't start today. And by the way, everyone says, is he going to invade Ukraine or is he not going to invade Ukraine? Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. Russian soldiers who were on site in Crimea took Crimea. And then effective Russian mercenaries have invaded eastern Ukraine. And he's been running a war ever since then. And his popularity has improved. His poll ratings, however you want to measure those, have improved because people generally rally around the leader when there's a foreign enemy, when there's a bad situation. And recently he's been in a particularly bad situation over the last 2 years, like many other leaders around the world, because COVID has just on top of the 20 years of dictatorship and money stealing and bad standard of living and economic stagnation, you now have a pandemic, lockdowns, economic contraction. And so all this stuff, has put Putin in a particularly bad position, and he needed something to bolster his popularity and to ensure that he doesn't get replaced or overthrown by somebody else who comes in. And all this sending troops to the border and making demands of NATO and all this kind of stuff is all part and parcel of his I would say weakness, his desperation, his feeling that he needs to do something to shore up his position at home.
Mm-hmm. So staying with that issue of public opinion in Russia, someone said to me once, and it's really stuck with me, that at some point the Russian people will choose between the refrigerator and the television set, meaning that they'll choose between these promises of glory and rallying around a leader in a time of conflict and the realities of their quality of life just not improving in the way that the regime had promised, and in some respects getting worse. At what point do you think the Russian people are seeing through this tactic? The invasion of Ukraine, it started in 2014. Maybe there was the public opinion bump at the time. We saw this with Chechnya right at the beginning of Putin's regime. But at what point do people say, okay, we've seen this movie before, we know what you're doing, and we've had enough? But also then, what meaningful ways would there be for them to express that sentiment in light of all the repression?
Well, in a normal democratic country, there would be opposition candidates who would be saying exactly those things and pointing it out and messaging constantly in speeches and so on and so forth. But Russia's not a normal democratic country, and anyone who has said those things is immediately imprisoned, exiled, or killed. And so what you have now is a situation where it's almost more brittle in a sense, because the more the pressure cooker inflates with pressure without any kind of release, the more explosive it will be when people finally have had enough. And we got a small taste of this in Kazakhstan a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. In Kazakhstan, it's kind of, I would say, almost a caricatured version of this kleptocracy that Russia has. And sort of out of nowhere, everybody just got so angry, and it was set off by gas prices going up for liquid gas that people use to power their cars there, and it was violent, and maybe some of the violence was premeditated, but that was just like a tiny little taster of what Russia could look like at some point when people lose their patience. But your question is, when can we see that? And the answer is, I don't know. And most importantly, Vladimir Putin doesn't know. And that's what he's most afraid of. I mean, he's most afraid of he's seen the videos of Ceausescu being hung from a tank and Gaddafi, killed in a tunnel. And that's not the way he wants to go. And so he's going to do everything possible. And everything that he does is all about self-preservation. It's about preserving the money he's stolen, preserving his freedom, and most importantly, preserving his life.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, this whole idea of color revolutions, right, as they're often called, right, where people get upset, they take to the streets, and they force a political change. It seems that this is the greatest fear of the regime, right? So they're to do everything possible to not only to prevent that from happening in their own country, but to discredit these kinds of efforts in other countries. And that's part of why Ukraine's democratization was seen as such a threat by the Putin regime, because it maybe provided an example of a path that Russia could follow. Is that part of the dynamic here as well?
Definitely. So these things are contagious, by the way. So remember when Tunisia, started with a fruit vendor setting himself on fire, which led to the overthrow of the Tunisian government, which led to the overthrow of the Egyptian government, which led to the Syrian civil war. These things are contagious. And so not so contagious, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. But if something like this succeeds in a neighboring country, the Russians will watch that and say, well, wait a second, if the Ukrainians can join the European Union and live like 5 times better than us, which is what happens when a country joins the European Union, which was the path that Ukraine wanted to go on, why should we be doing this whole sort of totalitarian experiment, which doesn't seem to make our lives better, and we can't even say what we think? And so Putin is desperate to make sure that around him that doesn't happen. And so, for example, in Belarus, they had an election, a fraudulent election there about a year and a half ago, and the people rose up in Belarus, and there was massive protests across the country, and Putin sent his own people in to help the dictator Lukashenko put that down. Same thing in Kazakhstan, where the Russians sent in troops to put down the uprising in Kazakhstan. And in Ukraine, there hasn't been, there's been a series of uprisings. There was an uprising which replaced the Russian sympathetic kleptocrat who was running the place. And that's always, and when he was replaced, that's always been a thorn in Putin's side, for sure. But I would say that what's going on in Ukraine right now is probably more to do with just having a war than it is to prevent it. This colored revolution stuff happened a long time ago. And I think he needs a war. He needs a war right now, or something close to it, so that he can, he can just be a wartime president, and anyone who's, being disloyal will quickly, lose that sentiment because everybody is rallying around the leader. I think he's really scared right now. He needs a war. And that's what this is about. And all these things fit together as well. He's never been happy with Ukraine wanting to go in the direction of the European Union. He's never been happy with Ukraine having Western leanings. He's, the idea that Ukraine could become part of NATO is extremely irritating to him. But the crux of this, in my mind, is just that, he needs to distract people away from their anger towards him, towards somebody else.
Yeah, so many great points there. This phenomenon of democratic contagion that can happen, especially within a culturally similar area where, throughout the Arab world, we saw that democratic contagion, the fear that Putin has of this happening in Eastern Europe, but at the same time, to say that right now, although that's still in the background, Putin is looking for he's looking for a war. He's looking for so how do we respond to that then? If because the premise of negotiation is that you have two different sides with specific objectives who broadly agree that they're better off negotiating to get to some kind of resolution in order to prevent costly conflict. But if one side is just committed to conflict because it's not the formal objectives, but it's the conflict itself that they are seeking, then what do we do in that situation? If that's what we're dealing with right now, how do we respond?
Well, the first way we respond is to recognize what you just said, which is that you can't negotiate if one side doesn't want to negotiate because they want the conflict. But it's very easy calculation. So Putin is saying to himself, there's rewards for doing this, and there's risks for doing this. The rewards are what we've just been talking about, which is that he shores up his political strength and influence. He ends up becoming more popular. That's the obvious upside for him. And the downside is at the moment kind of hard for him to calculate, because in the past, there hasn't been any huge downside for him there was no huge downside. There was no downside at all with Georgia when they took Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There was no downside. There was really very little downside to taking Crimea. There was a few sanctions, but that didn't seem to cause him any great pain. Hardly any downside in eastern Ukraine. No downside in shooting down MH17. No downside in bombing hospitals in Syria. No downside in hacking the US elections. And so he's kind of used to no downside. And so if we want to stop him from doing this, we have to present a credible picture of downside, and downside that he appreciates. I mean, it's quite remarkable to me to watch all these leaders, these Western leaders, sort of all saying different things, and pretty much saying nothing. So they're all saying, we want to have diplomacy. Well, what is diplomacy? You know, begging? Is diplomacy begging? Is diplomacy giving in? Is it appeasement? Is it giving him what he wants? Because it's certainly none of them are presenting a sort of cohesive and credible package of downside, which is what he needs to see. And so there are a bunch of things we can do to make life more painful in this scenario. I mean, the most obvious thing is if we don't want to go and fight in a war with Russia ourselves, which is pretty clear that none of us want to do, then we should certainly give Ukraine all the weapons that we can muster up to let them defend themselves. And you know, that started to happen, certainly happening more now than it was before. The British government has given them, I think, a $1.9 billion defense loan and flying in stuff. The US has done, I think, if I read correctly, Canada has put together a $120 million defense package. You know, these are good things, not dramatically good things. I don't think that this is going to change the equation, but it's a start, and the Ukrainians appreciate it. But the real place where we can create downside is with Vladimir Putin personally. And the easy way of doing that is to just come back to the analysis of who he is and how he got to where he was in the first place. And he is a kleptocrat, first and foremost. He's stolen an enormous amount of money, and he values his money. And he doesn't keep that money in his own name. He keeps that money in the name of people who hold it for him, what I call oligarch trustees. And those oligarch trustees don't keep that money in Russia. They keep it in the West. And this is Putin's huge exposed flank. This is his huge Achilles heel, because if we were to sanction, and I say sanction, freeze the assets of the oligarch trustees that look after Putin's money, Putin would see a big downside to what he's doing, a big and very personal downside.
That seems like it should be a really easy thing to do. I mean, if we're able to identify the names of the people in whom Putin has his money, if we can freeze those assets, then it seems fairly obvious that clearly communicating that will be a consequence. I mean, it's sort of baffling on some level in light of all the aggression that we've seen that hasn't been done already. But is there? But why have nations in the West kind of hesitated at using that sort of ultimate sanctions trigger? That still doesn't really cost us anything in significant terms, and would really hit him where it hurts.
Well, I think part of it is that a lot of our Western leaders want to be seen to be doing something, but are actually scared to do something that they know will really hit them where it counts. I think that they're kind of scared. I mean, they may be personally scared that they're going to be assassinated if they do this. I mean, this is really going right to the jugular. I mean, there's no messing around. And I mean, it's so asymmetric. We don't have to engage in any military conflict. We don't have to even experience any kind of economic pain from this. All we have to do, and we know who these people are. There's no mystery about these people. All we have to do is identify them and freeze their assets and use the Magnitsky Act, which exists to do this. The Magnitsky Act says anybody who's involved in corruption or human rights abuse can have their assets frozen. We can prove these people are involved in corruption. We know who they are. We should just freeze them. And we don't have to do it all at once. We can do it in stages. We can start with 5. We can make a list of 50, and we sanction 5 today to say, just to show you we're serious, we're gonna freeze the assets of these 5 of your trustees. You have 10 days to move your military equipment back from the border, or another 5 goes. And you know what? And if you don't, and you go forward, the whole 50 will be sanctioned. I guarantee you that Putin would not invade Ukraine because he doesn't want to lose all his wealth.
Yeah, that when you frame it in those terms, it seems so clear cut. That this isn't gonna, that we could prevent war through aggressive pointed sanctions. And we've talked so much about sanctions, and it's true. Governments want to look like they're doing things, so we always hear announcements of additional sanctions. But the critical question that we need to be asking, it seems, is: are those sanctions hitting where it counts? Are those the right sanctions that are aimed at deterring behavior, or are those sanctions aimed at satisfying a domestic audience?
Well, like, for example, they've just announced like one of the sanctions they want to do is to sanction future oil development. I mean, that ain't going to do nothing. Vladimir Putin's, I mean, any kind of long-term strategic, person might say, well, that's not good, but Putin, he doesn't care about that. He cares about his own money. Right.
So he's in it for himself. So that's where we have to have the sanctions. So let's talk at the same time that the sanctions piece is critically important, but let's talk also about deterring invasion, further invasion, we should say, through weaponry, through defense commitments and other things. Clearly Russia is not contemplating an invasion of the Baltic states because the Baltic states are members of NATO, right? That as much as Putin complains about NATO enlargement, that having Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia under that umbrella of clear collective security commitments means that that they have, relatively speaking, compared to Ukraine and Georgia, been left alone. So should we be looking now or in the future at the kind of binding security commitments being made to Ukraine and Georgia that have been made to the Baltic states and to Poland? What would the impact of that be? And what are the risks of doing that the possibility of NATO membership might provoke kind of advance intervention prior to that membership?
Well, it's a complicated story for a lot of different reasons. The most complicated part is that Ukraine and Georgia, might be, well, I mean, Georgia right now is run by a guy who's sort of, questionable about his allegiances. And Ukraine could easily be replaced. I mean, these are really kind of, sort of primitive places, and they could be, the democracies are primitive, and they could be replaced by, the people running them could end up being, not the kinds of people we want to, defend in some point for some reason. I mean, even Turkey, as a member of NATO, raises questions. And so, I mean, NATO is kind of a complex organization, and I think that these countries, before they ever become members of NATO, have to prove that they're bona fides as sort of members of the honest, democratic world before we take them in and want to protect them. I mean, Ukraine is doing itself no favors at the same, begging for help against the Russians, and at the same time prosecuting their former president as a traitor. Right now, Zelensky is going after Poroshenko. It doesn't make him the most sort of sympathetic guy we want to defend. I mean, we want to defend him because we don't like Russia. We don't necessarily want to defend him because he's this great westernized leader that we think is honest and good and full of virtue. And so it's not a black and white situation. The only thing that's black and white is we don't want Russia going around telling everybody who's going to be their slave country and who's not.
Yeah, I think from a Canadian perspective, there's a very close tie between Canada and Ukraine, and a lot of it's driven by that strong diaspora connection. I know the Ukrainian diaspora here in particular is vocal about the need to stand with and defend Ukraine, but also support anti-corruption initiatives and measures that are going to continue to strengthen the trajectory of Ukrainian democracy. And I take your point about the nature of NATO. I suppose the counter argument might be that there's always a risk, especially now the nature of the world as it is. There's always a risk of democratic backsliding. We've seen it in a significant way in Turkey, and you can't really rule that out almost anywhere. And maybe that's just a fundamental problem with NATO not having an expulsion mechanism. But is there a way to have, I guess, short of NATO membership, if we say, okay, we want to invite these countries to be on a trajectory towards NATO membership, that they may not be, that there may not be a consensus that they're ready for right now. I mean, can there still be some kind of binding security guarantees that are given if the United States were to say, well, we're gonna have people on the ground ready to fight alongside Ukrainians? I mean, what would the impact of that be? Could that kind of interim security guarantee be provided in a way that would be meaningful and deter Russian aggression?
Well, such a guarantee was actually provided. There was something called the Budapest Memorandum. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Ukraine all signed a memorandum in Budapest, a binding agreement that said if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, then all three countries would guarantee Ukraine its territorial integrity. And so I would argue, putting aside NATO, that the United States and Great Britain, and Russia for that matter, but obviously they're the antagonist here, but the United States and Great Britain have a sort of treaty duty to defend Ukraine above and beyond just supplying military equipment. I mean, it's, we asked them to give up their nuclear capability, and now they're being, they've already had pieces of their country taken over, and now there's a threat of much more. And so, I mean, I think it is it's kind of unbelievable, if you will, that that such an agreement could be just completely ignored, and no one's even talking about it right now. It's not even as if this is something that's part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But I suppose if today the British and American governments were prepared to telegraph that any further invasions would be seen in the context of the commitments they made under the Budapest Memorandum, because it seems to me that they've sort of telegraphed the opposite, right? That they've sort of telegraphed that the consequences will be severe, a la sanctions, but that they are not prepared to be sort of militarily involved in responding to the Russian invasion. Am I wrong in that assessment, that they've sort of telegraphed that that they'll be there but not fully there if there's an invasion?
Well, last summer they telegraphed it so loud and clear it's not even funny, by saying that we're going to withdraw 3,000 troops from Afghanistan and let 38 million people end up under the yoke of the Taliban. I mean, the message there was we so dislike any type of military engagement, even if it's to hold the status quo together, by a shoestring with 3,000 troops, that we're ready to create a massive refugee crisis, a humanitarian disaster of unimaginable consequences. So so if you're Vladimir Putin and you see that, what do you think? You think they're going to go and like defend Ukraine? Of course not. They're not going to defend anybody. Everybody is so busy licking their wounds and trying to disengage from any type of military involvement, no matter what the consequences. That was similar. Obama had the red line on Syria, and when the use of chemical weapons against civilians, and when Assad crossed that red line, he didn't do anything, and that was a message for every dictator that America wasn't going to get involved in all of your nasty business. Do whatever you want, and I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan sent a similar message to dictators like Putin that there's such a distaste for military involvement that no one wants to do anything.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. Of course, the irony of that point is that when you are clear in sending messages of deterrence, you're actually much less likely to need to be engaged militarily. That a posture that is not deterring violence and aggression eventually draws you into a position of maybe needing to act to protect your own security, but so much ground has already been lost in the meantime. You're a big part of the public conversation around this issue of deterrence, of the West kind of standing up for democratic values. What would you suggest to everyday Canadians, to policymakers, to everyday people in other countries about how to reassert this sense of our own determination to defend our values, such that we can deter? I mean, we're talking about Ukraine. We could talk about Taiwan. There are a lot of cases where potentially the resolve of the West is going to be tested, and we want to deter those kinds of aggressive actions so as to avoid conflict and preserve peace. What are the concrete steps we can take towards doing that?
Well, Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster and now the Russian opposition activist, said it very nicely. We should fight them in the banks instead of with tanks. This is the big leverage we have, is economic leverage, and we have economic leverage both because there's so much. All the individuals involved in Russia and China and various other places all have money in the West. And that doesn't cost, there's no blood that will be spilled in freezing somebody's assets. And so my big contribution, if I've made any to the world, is the Magnitsky Act, which is this incredibly surgical, targeted tool, just going after specific bad guys who are the decision makers who have assets in the West and punishing them. And it's so easy to do. It doesn't cost us anything. No blood gets spilled. And it really does. It is truly a punishment that means something, and potentially a deterrent. Not necessarily always. I mean, I don't think that North Korea or the Myanmar are deterred by Magnitsky sanctions because they're so disconnected from the Western world. But everybody who is connected to the Western world is deterred by Magnitsky sanctions. And we know that based on how angry everybody gets when they get sanctioned. And Canada, for example, had the Magnitsky Act passed in 2017, sanctioned a bunch of people right after it was passed, and they haven't used it in the last 4 years, since 2018. And I mean, so why? I mean, it costs nothing. It costs a few million Canadian dollars a year to put lawyers in to look at evidence of malfeasance in China and Russia, and they should be sanctioning these people. I mean, it seems like the biggest opportunity with the lowest cost to do the most good, and it's inexplicable why the Canadian government would not do that.
Yeah. So this has been a great conversation. And just in the last couple minutes that we have, let's really zero in on Magnitsky sanctions as a tool. Whether we're talking about Putin, the kleptocrats around him, or those violating human rights from any part of the world. This is a piece of political technology that you more or less invented, saying that we need to have legislative tools that allow us to target individuals who are involved in human rights abuses, sanction them as individuals to prevent them from moving their money or traveling, and that these can be punishments and deterrents, recognizing the selfishness that often motivates these actors. Sanctioning their countries don't do much good because the leaders aren't in it for the good of their countries; they're in it for themselves. So targeting them individually, fighting them. I love that phrase, fighting them in the banks and not with tanks. You've done a lot of work getting these acts passed around the world. As you mentioned, we've had some challenges getting the Canadian government and other governments as well to use the Magnitsky Sanctions tool, because you pass the law, it gives the government a tool to use. They don't necessarily use it. If you can just share, I know we could probably do a whole nother podcast on the Magnitsky Sanctions tool itself, but why is this tool so effective? And what can we do to get more countries to pass Magnitsky sanctions laws, but secondly, to compel governments to use the Magnitsky Act to target potentially powerful and well-connected people, but to use those financial tools to hold them accountable and spare a lot of blood and violence along the way by using financial tools instead?
Well, so the reason why the Magnitsky Act is so effective is that if a person is sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act by the United States, Great Britain, or in Canada, the moment they get put on this list, they basically become a non-person in the world of commerce and finance. Every bank will close their account. Nobody will be able to send them money, receive money from them, trade with them. So, for example, Carrie Lam, the governor of Hong Kong, was sanctioned by the United States on the Magnitsky Act. And her bank account was closed. And so she has to receive her quite sizable salary from the Hong Kong government, which is like 800,000 US dollars. She's got to receive it in cash. And, all of a sudden, and that's humiliating. She's the governor of Hong Kong, and no bank will touch her. Even a bank in her district will not do business with her, because those banks don't want to be in violation of sanctions laws. And so that's the reason why, and so basically it's really a kind of a sort of huge black mark on anybody who gets sanctioned, because it's very difficult to get unsanctioned, and their lives get totally disrupted. But beyond just the people who are sanctioned, it also scares the hell out of everybody who's done similar types of bad things and hasn't yet been sanctioned, and they're wondering if they're next. And so it creates sort of panic among the elite about who's going to be next. Now, we at the moment, we have 34 countries that have Magnitsky Acts around the world. And so we're just doing what I call a mopping up operation to finish up with with the rule of law countries. We have the United States, Canada, UK, 27 countries of the European Union. We have Montenegro, Kosovo. We got Australia in December of last year. So all we need now is, I think, New Zealand, Japan, and interestingly, there's a bunch of countries within the European Union that aren't happy with how the European Union is putting this, implementing it. And so, like, the Czech Republic is going to have their own Magnitsky Act. The Irish,
which would allow them to go above and beyond the European Union.
Right. So if the European Union doesn't act because they get vetoed by one of their members, the Czech Republic can do it independently. Ireland is doing the same thing and working on other countries. But the big challenge is actually not getting countries to pass the legislation, it's getting them to use the legislation. And Canada is kind of a great case study in the fact that you have this. And like, why is, like 100 people were sanctioned by the US government in December last year, and like nobody was in Canada. Why? Why is Canada is supposed to be the country with, like, this great reputation as being this moral beacon, and
we're doing our best, but
it's not. I mean, I love Canada, I love Canadians, but God Almighty, do I not? I'm not happy with the Canadian government in their mismanagement of this tool, and I'm hoping to spend some time with you and other lawmakers to put pressure on the Canadian government to start using it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. the one thing that I'm really keen on doing in Canada is creating some mechanism of a parliamentary trigger around Magnitsky sanctions, so that a group of parliamentarians, perhaps a committee, perhaps it could be a large number of citizens. Essentially, we're familiar with the idea of nominating someone for an award. This would be kind of the opposite, nominating someone for a Magnitsky sanction. And clearly it would have to remain the discretion of the government. You know, you can't have people that aren't in the government making determinative decisions about this. But that you could have groups of citizens or parliamentarians be able to nominate people for Magnitsky sanctions, and then the government would be forced to respond in some way and provide reasons. I think that that could be a really powerful mechanism, and I think similar to what exists in the United States. So, Bill, thanks so much for joining us. Maybe last word to you, if you want to comment at all on this, the parliamentary trigger mechanism and how that might help with the situation in Russia, if we could see civil society and parliamentarians be able to compel the government to answer some of these questions about why people haven't been sanctioned. And then any last words from you on what we need to know about Russia, how we can stand with the Russian people to see the advance of freedom and democracy.
Well, this parliamentary trigger is a really important idea. It's one that they have a congressional trigger in the United States, which allows Congress to challenge the president and, as you say, nominate people for sanctions. And then the president has a duty to respond within 120 days to say yay or nay. There should be such a parliamentary trigger in Canada, and there should also be the Canadian government should fund a big operation in the Foreign Office to make sure that there's enough people there to vet the information and consider sanctions and implement sanctions. I think part of the problem is just nobody knows how to do it, and that's not that wouldn't be a good excuse if that were the case. And so I mean, I'm going to definitely do whatever I can to help you and your colleagues get that in place. And as far as Russia goes, I think it's really important, very important, as a final word, to say that our beef is not with the Russian people. The Russian people are just as much victims as everyone else is. Our beef is with Vladimir Putin and his regime. And the more we can target him and his regime and leave the Russian people alone, the more likely it is that we'll end up with a better outcome in this whole ugly mess.
Absolutely. Bill, thank you again for joining us, but more importantly, thank you for the incredible work you've done, really inventing this piece of political technology, the Magnitsky Sanctions mechanism. And I think you've left all of us with a lot to think about really the concrete steps we can take to try to deter what would be a catastrophic further invasion of Ukraine. There are things we can do about it, that we have the power to do. And we should do them. Bill, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in a week with another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. Please leave a review. Thanks so much, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.